The Venceremos Brigade is a crucial institution, we think, on the left, and has been incredibly influential in infusing internationalist politics into the kind of analysis and action of lots and lots of people who have come through the center, who work with the center, and in our left movements more generally. And so we're really excited when the Bay Area group that's working on the 50th anniversary activities was interested in doing something with us, and this is the culmination of that scheme. So, what we're going to do tonight is we have 4 brigadistas here who are going to talk a little bit about their experiences, and then we'll have some time for Q&A with the audience as well. You ready? Yeah. All right. Very exciting. So we're going to go chronologically, and I'm going to say a couple things about these lovely people. And I know that bios are always just embarrassing and terrible and never accurate, but I'm going to say a couple things about all of you anyway, and then you can correct them when your time comes and say what really matters. And by chronologically, I mean chronologically by order of, how you're listed in terms of the brigades you went on for tonight's events. So we're going to start with Phil Hutchings. So Phil is a longtime organizer and activist. You might know him from his work with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, where he played a variety of roles, including as national chairman. You might know him from his work here in the Bay Area's Black Alliance for Just Immigration, BAJI, Causa Justa Just Cause, or as the co-founder of the Institute for Multiracial Justice, with Jason, which also used to be housed upstairs next door at 522 Valencia. He's a great friend of the center. We're very enthusiastic anytime we can get Phil to join us for conversation. And it's also Phil's birthday tonight. If you did not extra roll of honor for Phil.
Right, that's what turned into the party.
Right? Exactly. Next to me here is Linda Burnham, who recently was a senior advisor to the National Domestic Workers Alliance, and rumor has it that you retired, but rumor also has it that you didn't really.
Yeah, you're right.
You might know Linda from her leadership in the Third World Women's Alliance, or with the Women of Color Resource Center here in the Bay Area, and in addition to her participation in Venceremos Brigade, Linda has also led delegations of women of color to UN conferences in Kenya, China, and South Africa. She's a prolific writer and speaker and a really, really important analyst and dear friend of the center, so please welcome Linda Burnham. Melba Maldonado is a longtime advocate and organizer for marginalized people across Latin America, which I always put the Caribbean and Latin America as well. And for Black people in the U.S. She's currently the executive director of La Raza Community Resource Center. You might also know her from her work with the San Francisco Immigrant Legal and Education Network, SF-ILEN, and the San Francisco Immigration Legal Defense Collaborative, among many others. Mission stalwart is the word I'm looking for, and important movement leader, Melba Maldonado. And then representing the youth wing, we have Jason Ferreira. Jason is Associate Professor and Chair of the Department of Race and Resistance Studies in the College of Ethnic Studies at San Francisco State University. He helped found the Institute for Multiracial Justice, aforementioned, the Center for Political Education, and the Howard Zinn Book Fair. Jason's scholarship focuses on the history of radicalism and within and across communities of color, including a book in progress that is the first social history of the Third World Strike at San Francisco State.
Oh.
What's the working title of that book, Jason?
An Undying Love for Our People.
With an undying love for our people, Jason Ferreira.
Yes.
So, panelists, I'm going to ask all of you just to answer the same question by way of getting us started. And regardless of your advanced years or not so advanced years, and regardless of your high stature in the movement, when your time runs out, I'm going to ask you to stop speaking. Is that okay?
Bravo!
And that goes for any of you, too. So be forewarned, I'm not opposed to asking you to stop speaking. I am also not opposed to asking you to turn off your telephones if you wouldn't mind doing that. So what I'd like the four of you to reflect on, and we'll go in the order that I introduced you, is your experience as a brigadista. So what was your motivation for going? How did your experience influence your political work after you returned from your delegation? And for you, what is the lasting importance of the Venceremos Brigade? So Phil, can we start with you, please?
Sure, I have a choice, huh?
No, no.
Sure. I think my interest in going on the Venceremos Brigade was that I had become very active in the Black liberation struggle in the United States and in the radical movement and radical left movement and the anti-Vietnam War movement. And I was kind of wanting to get some international experience, particularly more than just reading a book or reading an article or reading something in a newspaper. Thank you. And Brigade became a way to do that. And I was a member of the organizing committee, the organizing national committee for the first four Venceremos Brigades, and which was from 1969 December to 1971. And I got to go on the second and the third brigade, and help other people go on the first and the fourth, as well as the second and third. And I think part of it, my major interests in going on the brigade was to find out what being in a socialist country was all about. And then also doing something to help and work it out in terms of doing something, not just being a tourist, but also playing a real concrete role in what we call solidarity with the Cuban Revolution. And I think that for me it was a new experience. It was my first real international experience being outside the U.S. I had been, as a little kid, about 9 years old, we had gone up to Niagara Falls in Canada, and I was living in Ohio, and that was my first experience outside the U.S. But that's about all I had. And I had the very fortunate experience of going to Mexico, because we were going through Mexico to get to Cuba. And the Cuban consulate, I guess, or probably the embassy, couldn't find our visas. So I ended up staying in Mexico City for about 10 days.
Wow.
And it was looking back on it, it was a spectacular experience, because I got to experience Latin America, a part of Latin America, before I got to Cuba. And because what I realized is, not having had that experience, the contrast between wherever I was going, Cuba, would basically be with the United States, which is what I always do. So going to a third world country, but from a first world country, the United States, is everything from hot water, cold water, toilets, politics, everything to be contrasted between the United States and Cuba. And by spending a week in Mexico, especially in the capital, and getting to walk around with somebody who's from Mexico, I got a chance to see what Mexico was like, and seeing a more useful comparison between Cuba and Mexico than I would have between Cuba and the United States. I say that because I think it's important to have perspective. And I remember one of the things that, the Cubans told us a lot of suggestions of things to remember, but I remember one that they said, if there's only two things you remember about this country, their country, which is different from yours, is that we're a country of the third world. And so our experiences are quite different than yours. We're also a socialist country. And that makes a major distinction between how things happen from your experience in the United States to what's happening and what you're seeing in Cuba. So that was very useful, those two things, as ways to always check my judgments against what I was seeing or hearing or experiencing, and realizing my own background. I've been on 4 brigades. The first one, the 2nd brigade, where we cut sugarcane. The 3rd brigade, where we went to the Isle of Youth and picked coffee and planted trees. And it was probably the main brigade, the 3rd brigade, which made a real substantial contribution, because it was on the Isle of Youth, or sometimes called the Isle of Pines, where our labor was not just honorary, but also it was extremely useful. I went on the 15th Brigade in the 80s, and there we were a construction brigade, helping the Cubans build houses. I always used to joke, I would never want to live in a house that I had anything to do with the city. But so we helped the Cubans. We put together cement. We were up at the top of those apartment buildings, 6-story, 8-story buildings without elevators, and the hot sun, just doing construction work, and that was new. And on the 25th Brigade, which Jason will talk more about, is that we did tobacco, and that was mostly indoors, which was a big surprise because all our work previously had been outdoors in Cuba. So I got to see a lot of Cuba and experience what was happening. The 2nd Brigade was the largest brigade ever. We had somewhere between a low of 780 to around 800 people. And there was never a brigade that's after that. He was asked us not to bring so many people down because it taxed their infrastructure, and they had to have cooks and vehicles to take us around the island, and people to do translation, and 800 was a little bit much. But we felt pushed to do that because of the 1st Brigade. The 1st Brigade, and I don't know how this passed any type of political censorship, including my own. The building was that we were going to have 900 people on the 1st Brigade. 300 black people, 300 brown people, and 300 yellow people. No mention about Native Americans or white people. We ended up with about 200 people, 90% of them were white. And we were totally embarrassed. And we got criticized at all levels about it, particularly from the right wing. And I remember Senator James Eastland from Mississippi, who I had encountered in the civil rights movement, actually wrote something in the congressional record, or he put it in the congressional record in 1970, that Cuba had such little support that the left-wing radicals of the United States could only find 200 people to go and work on their brigade and do all kind of nefarious things like learning guerrilla warfare and stuff like that. So we said that can't be the verdict of how this brigade gets seen. And so we spent a lot of time from December of '69 to March of the next year, going all over the country. I remember getting snowbound in Chicago. Brigade ran out of money. I spent a week in Chicago in the snow, and but we knocked on doors and went to organization. But the 1st Brigade did something very dynamic for us in terms of the organization and the map. And it showed that basically the Venceremos Brigade existed. Right. Because what happened when we were trying to organize for the 1st Brigade, nobody believed we could get them there. Who are you? How are you going to get them there? What kind of transportation? You can't go directly to Cuba. I have better things in my own organization to do than go to Cuba. So by the fact that it existed, that it happened, people got very anxious to go on the brigade in Cuba. And the 2nd Brigade, with roughly 800 people, benefited from that tremendously. The second thing I was interested in finding out through the brigade, and because the brigade brought together people from all over the U.S., is that I was interested in learning something about the North American left. And through that operation of seeing people in different brigades from all over the country, we got to see people where we would not have run into them in our own, whatever local city we were in. We saw different organizations we had heard about or seen written about, or maybe seen a spokesman come from that group to our particular city. And so, and particularly being on the National Organizing Committee, we had a role to try to make sure everybody played nice and worked and together. And that was difficult in many times because there was not that experience of doing that. So we had a lot of struggles, both with the North American Brigade, people who didn't want to work, thought they just wanted to come down there and celebrate the revolution and drink rum and maybe talk to Fidel about it, stuff like that. Doing work, sugarcane, the hot stuff, impossible. The other thing was that with the Cubans had some warped impressions about us. And so the question is, how do you struggle with people you basically totally respect? But around things we felt were necessary for our political existence. I'll talk maybe later in the question Q&A, you can talk more about that. But one thing I would mention, because this was the height of the black liberation struggle, is we wanted to have black caucuses on the brigade, and to be able to meet among themselves to talk about the problems. And the Cubans felt that was totally antithetical to what kind of revolution that they had made on the island. And they fought it consistently. And we had major arguments with our compañeros. And so learning how to struggle with people you're going to see tomorrow in the fields and work with and still have differences. And in the final analysis, which was attributed to the Cuban Revolution, they decided to let it go. And said, if you want to form these black caucuses, you can. And what it taught me about the Cubans is that they never agreed with our position at all. But they understood and they looked to see, did it work in the fields, the practical work. And they saw that there were people who could work better because they could talk to people who they knew or from movements they respected, as opposed to just anybody. And therefore, it strengthened the work with the brigade. So there were a lot of different kind of examples like that where we could have struggle and unity and struggle with our friends and not go around calling somebody revisionist or ultra left. And you know the terms as well as I do. And that was very useful too. So I'm going to shut up and let I think Linda.
Hi. How you doing? I want to start with this. This is from the 15th of March, 1972. Dear Mommies, it is absolutely beautiful here. We arrived at about 6 a.m. Saturday morning after spending 7 hours in the Mexico City airport. Then a Soviet-made prop plane to Jose Marti Airport in Havana. We had a cultural program of folk music and a huge fiesta Saturday night, and on Sunday we went to a beach called Hibacoa. Monday morning we got up at 5:30 a.m., underlined, ate, and went to work. We are building a small town instead of cutting cane. It will be a town for the dairy workers in this area, about 2 hours from Havana. The International Brigade, made up of young people from all over the world, is building the secondary school and a high school with dormitories. We are building homes and an administration building. We've been digging the foundations and pouring cement. The work is not quite so back-breaking as cane cutting would have been, but it is still difficult, and I will be very strong when I get back, and also very black from working in the sun. The Cubanos love Angela, I'm going to come back to that, very much, and are constantly asking me for buttons and information. They sing a beautiful song about her, which some of you may remember. The young Cubans are incredibly friendly to all the North Americans and very interested in the U.S. movement. They encourage us daily to try to form a unified front when we return. Now this is a little later. This afternoon we unloaded 690-pound bags of cement. I'm going to put some Bengay on my back and go to sleep. I will try to write you every week. That certainly didn't happen. And I hope some of the letters will get through. It is hard to find time to read or write here because the Cubans want us to get the most out of our time, and there are always presentations of one sort or another. Last night there was a very good lecture on Cuban history, and tonight there are 2 movies. I'll see you in 2 months. Love to everyone. If you get a chance to come here, don't pass it up. Love, Linda. This is an artifact I didn't know existed until 3 weeks ago. So, you know, some of us wrote letters, we sent them into the atmosphere. Who knew whether they ever arrived? I never knew, I never asked. And then 3 weeks ago, I was back home in Brooklyn with my 104-year-old mother. And 104-year-old people like to kind of finger treasures, pictures, and so she starts reading this thing to me. I'm like, what the hell? After you asked me to do this. So it was some kind of strange synchronicity. So I was 24 at the time, and when Rachel asked me to do this, I knew I didn't have time to prepare, and now I know that there's like about 4 or 5 different strands of things I'd love to talk about that I'm not going to have time to talk about. So I'm just going to like throw some shit out there, throw some things out there. Just in terms of major lessons, so I guess the main bottom line lesson for me is the kind of long-term vision of the Cubans and their faith in some real raggedy people in terms of our politics, to be frank. They stepped out on faith and brought hundreds of untrained, very various young North Americans to their country because they had a long-term vision and an investment, I think, both in our political development, believe it or not, and in what it would take to defend the Cuban Revolution. So somewhere kind of deep in the political structure of the Cuban Revolution, folks had a really long-reaching vision, which is, I think, a deep lesson for anybody doing political work, because it wasn't about the cane. Let's just say that. And it wasn't about the houses. So there's something in there about faith and generosity, both in creating some conditions that might help in the defense of the Cuban Revolution, but also in an investment in developing a strain of internationalism in a broad set of young North Americans who didn't have it. So that's one strand. And then I want to pick up on something that Phil was talking about, which is there's one thing about having kind of deep strategic interest in alignment, and that does not mean that you're going to agree on everything out there, right? And it's also true that if you're a young person, 24 years old in my case, and you're in conversation with somebody who's essentially a representative of the governing political party, at some point you're going to be in a conversation that's above your pay grade, like way above your pay grade. Way, way, way above your pay grade, right? I've been a political activist for a very long time, from my high school years, and when I went into the brigade, I was mostly working on the Angela Davis Defense Committee, which was right up under Visadero and Turk when the Fillmore was a Fillmore. And Angela was, this was March 72. She was, maybe she had just been let out on bail, but her trial, which had been moved to San Jose, had not yet commenced. Anyway, she was not yet free. So there was also a global movement to free Angela Davis. There's a back conversation about what that global movement was about. But this strand about being in a situation that's above your pay grade, in this instance, had to do with the fact that the Cubans had an interest in stabilizing the work of the brigade in a structure that they had some faith in. So when I went on the 6th contingent, I'm just going to talk the truth. When I went on the 6th contingent of the Venceremos Brigade, I went on the 5th, and then I went as a jefe on the 6th. I came back, and the people I had gone with, and the people who were leading the brigade here in the Bay Area were purged. And I had some very complicated conversations in Cuba before we came back. And I literally had no idea where it hit me. Zero, none. I don't know if all this needs to be on a video, but anyway.
Doesn't have to be.
Yeah, but what that was about was the Cubans seeking a way to kind of stabilize the brigade in political forces that they had trust in. It had to do with party-to-party relations. It had to do with them viewing that set of people who led the brigade here in the Bay Area at that time as Maoists, which I certainly wasn't. And as folks who were spending too much time on political education, having to do with things unfolding here in the US, and why was there that much emphasis on that when really what needed to be on the agenda was getting these people to Cuba? So there's that. I'm going to leave that because I want to go on to something else. Not for very long, evidently. I just wanted to also, let me just throw this out there. There's also a piece I'm again going to pick up on film, because one of the strands in the political education piece here in the Bay Area, and I need to call out Herzing's name in particular in relationship to this, is that one of the dynamics in Cuba for Black brigadistas in particular was kind of an imposition of the frame of U.S. racism on what was going on in Cuba, right? So people did not necessarily know how to interpret what they were seeing on the ground in Cuba, and interpreted it out of a framework, out of a framework of U.S. racism. And the particularities of what it means to have an independence movement that's linked to an anti-abolitionist movement and have independent forces who are also abolitionist forces, as against having slaveholders be the founding fathers. Having a one-drop rule, not having a one-drop rule, all of those kinds of dynamics and the social, political, and juridical infrastructures of race and racism being distinct in those two different places. I'm just saying that the Cuban Revolution and being in Cuba gave us an opportunity to kind of explore those things, which have then been kind of a central dynamic of my inquiry and work over the years. Okay.
Thanks.
Long-term friendships also.
Yeah.
Well, first of all, compañeros, long live the Cuban Revolution. I was thinking, what to say a couple of weeks ago, how to prepare. I usually do not write everything. I like to, things come to my mind. And I believe it was something I read, maybe Jason put up some interesting article or something I would check on the Facebook, and of course I said, Che Guevara was the figure, was the theory, was the praxis, was the guiding light for my generation as a Puerto Rican activist. And that's what I thought about when I was in Cuba, Che. And very interestingly, Ricardo Alarcón, who was, I forgot his title within the Cuban hierarchy, but I know he was very close to Fidel, gifted me a collection of Che Guevara books while I was there in the brigade, which I treasure to this day. At any rate, I was thinking about Che Guevara because I was thinking how much he loved children. And as a brigadista, you are taken to schools and you see los pioneros with the little red bandanas. And their slogan is, Seremos como el Che. We will be like Che. And I was thinking about those children who are incarcerated, who are treated like animals, who are left to die at the border of the United States. And I'm asking, what will El Che do for these kids? I know for a fact, and I discovered this when I went to Cuba, that the Cubans and the Cuban government, the Cuban Revolution, cares about kids. They care deeply about children under the most terrible conditions of capital, financial, and economic blockade. The kids go to school. The kids have free health care. And the kids have a techo over their heads, a roof over their heads. And that's the most important thing that I learned, because I saw it in Cuba. Now, I went to Cuba in 1981, on the 12th. When I went to Cuba, I was not a novice. So that, I knew what I was going to be looking for and expecting, etc. And I had been an organizer in the East Coast, in Newark, New Jersey for many, many years, housing, welfare rights, Puerto Rican independence, and basically all kinds of revolutionary things. So I knew what I was going to get into. I was in Newark. I don't think Felicia and Teresa, who were the CNs at that time, had to worry about my political development. At any rate, no, it's true, because I was representing the Puerto Rican Socialist Party here, which I came here to organize. And when I went to Cuba, since I was already, politically developed, what I gathered from my visit was, number one, the admiration, yes, it was true, yes, it is true, of the achievements of the Cuban Revolution. And that was really, really very important to me. Why? Because in Puerto Rico, who received a lot of exiles from Cuba, in Puerto Rico, the anti-Cuban propaganda was immense, especially in the 70s and 80s and 60s. Very violent people, anti-Cubans, who killed compañeros in Puerto Rico, who would attack our events, not only in Puerto Rico, but also in New York and New Jersey. So, there was a virulent anti-Cuban propaganda. But seeing what measures the Cuban Revolution took to guarantee the well-being of the population, despite, like I said, the blockade, ending illiteracy, building houses, making sure that there was equity in terms of how you live. Everybody would eat. Of course, there is no supermarkets like here. Oh my God, there is no Safeways, all kinds of things that you can waste your money on. But that is what I learned, and this is why, to me, it was really truly a revelation. Like, nobody lied to me. And yes, it is possible. It is possible to have a better world, to have a society that treats you with equity, to each according to the needs. And it is very important to do that. Also, the brigade, in the brigade, I learned to work with others better. When you are in the Puerto Rican Socialist Party, you breathe sleep, and eat Puerto Rico struggle. You know, so it is when then in the brigade, you know, you meet people from all over, like you said. You know, that was really important to me. And also working with others, you know, helped me personally to be less rajatabla. That's the word that means Stalinist. Or you know what I'm saying? Very, very strict about your the way you think and stuff like that. So to me, that was a good thing. The group situation, the following, tomorrow we do this and tomorrow, you know, getting up at 5:30 in the morning with the Sarah's, ¿cómo se llama? Sarah Gonzalez talking about Playa Girón, you know, that was our wake-up song every day at the camp. And you get up and you go to, you have breakfast, the same thing every day, and then you go to work, and, you know, you work, and we work in construction. And then you go back, shower up, and go to an event. After 4 or 5 days, I was truly exhausted. We went to meet Fidel. Well, we don't meet him personally. He was speaking into a big crowd. And I'm embarrassed to say, totally to this day, that I fell asleep, just like Tony did. I closed my eyes just to kind of immerse myself in what he's saying. I kept falling asleep. And I would do everything possible. But you know what? I have to admit it, I did fall asleep. I never told Felicia or anybody, but you know, it's just exhausting. Because he spoke for 2 or 3 hours. Yeah, he spoke a lot. And at any rate, that was something that I always remember. But meeting and working with others. And also, most importantly for me, was to meet and share with something that the Cuban Revolution taught us very well to this day about internationalism. And that was very key. We met Palestinians, we met Africans from different countries who were there also, their delegations. We met, I personally had long conversations with the Polisario Front folks that really impressed me at that time. The struggles that they were having, etc. And also, just to see what the Cuban Revolution had done for Puerto Rico independence. And that's not an easy, an easy debt that we have a big debt with the Cuban Revolution for that. Very important. The Cubans brought the case of Puerto Rican colonial status to the United Nations, to the non-aligned nations, and had us do an office in Geneva, the consulate. So our struggle was picked up by all these other folks. So therefore, when we are in Cuba talking to the Polisario Front, they knew about Puerto Rico independence. They knew what was going on. They're from Mexico. And at that time when we went, there were many people from Central America struggles that we were also able to meet. And also from other parts of Latin America. And so that was an incredible experience that I will never forget. And I know the brigadistas that come on this brigade, please think about that, okay? Take every opportunity to talk to others and learn about their struggles. And also another great thing of the Cuban Revolution in terms of strengthening the Puerto Rican independence, but it also, with all the ups and downs that you and Linda went through, let me tell you, look at us here. That generation that went to Cuba in the 70s and 80s and even 90s, and hopefully for the future. When they come back, they continue the work of anti-imperialism. And that's the idea. And the Cubans were right. Long live the Cuban Revolution.
So I went on the 25th contingent. That was my first contingent back in 1994. So I first met Phil. And I was trying to think about what I wanted to share. Cuba and my relationship with Cuba through the brigade really has given me so much. But I am kind of an outlier up here on this stage. Even though I'm supposed to represent youth, I don't represent youth. But I do represent, I think, in some ways, a generation. Because one of the things that's different between my experience and I think the three who've come before is of a generational nature. And so some of my comments that I kind of prepared, and I feel the same way. Like I have a lot of ideas, and so I'm just going to throw some stuff out and maybe come back to some of it in Q&A or not get to it at all. But I think one thing is that, and even reviewing this fantastic book that was done about the early days of the brigade and the testimonials from the early days of the brigade, I think it's the first and the second. First and second, yeah. How much the brigade in the early years were part of a political moment, a historic moment marked by possibility, rising expectations. Materially, there's still the post-war boom that fueled the generation's activism. Politically, we got Mac Elbaum in the room. Revolution was in the air, right? And there were possibilities. I was looking through the thing, and our good friend Marty Price, I found a quote from him where he says, "For the 70s will be the decade of the decisive struggle." Venceremos. Well, the 70s didn't quite turn out that way. What? Right. But while the revolution wasn't right around the corner, in fact, capital, as we all know now, went on the offensive during the 1970s, cramming neoliberalism down our throats. There was still that sense of possibility, right? The Vietnamese won in 75, Cabral in Guinea-Bissau in 74, Angola, MPLA in Angola. So there were all these different, and of course the Sandinistas in 79. That there was still this possibility of winning, that winning was possible. And Cuba sort of sat in some ways at the epicenter of that, right? The Organization for the Solidarity of Peoples of Asia, Africa, and Latin America, create 1, 2, 3, many Vietnams, right? That wasn't my world at all. But yet I hungered for it, And it's a weird thing. I was thinking to myself, is it possible to be nostalgic for something that you didn't have a hand in? But in some ways, I did. And I still haven't gotten my head around what that means. But my reality, my generation's reality, was quite different. And it's a generation marked by, and I even see it in my students today, lowered expectations, disillusionment, right? I am the generation, I came of age in the 1980s around Reagan, under Reaganism, austerity, privatization, militarization, the war on drugs, We reaped the whirlwind of Prop 13, right? And that's a very different material reality that my generation and later generations experienced. Death squads in El Salvador, Contras in Nicaragua, and then the Sandinistas losing in 1990, right? And then of course, a very sort of defining moment for many people in my generation. Two things: the first Gulf War, and also the LA uprising in '92, right? And I should say, myself, Eric Quesada, who I met on the 95th, on the 95th contingent, 25th contingent. It was in 1994. the left was different in the early 1990s. The left was in crises, right? The Soviet Union had dissolved, the Sandinistas had lost, U.S. military invasions were happening, you know, in Panama, and, you know, there was no left in the way that socialist left, I'm talking about an organized left, in a way that previous generations had experienced, right? Francis Fukuyama had written The End of History, right? Capitalism had been triumphant. The CPUSA, where, you know, this is a building that's owned by the Kendra Alexander, Eric Quesada, you know, part of a move that you know, the CPUSA, there was a split in committees of correspondence, but this was happening all over the place in the left. And so, to be a socialist in the early 1990s was to feel, particularly my generation, right, somewhat of an oddity. You know, socialism was considered, I mean, you wouldn't know now, right? Like, there's a story in Time magazine recently that 40% of people in this country now believe socialism is back on the table, you know? That was not the case in the early 90s, right? I mean, the only people that, I mean, what kind of socialism is up for debate, but yet in the early 90s, you know, socialism was considered passé. It was only, you know, sort of tenured academics or, you know, sort of, let's just say older folk, older white folk, you know, who didn't have much relationship to young folk of color, you know. And so it was kind of tough. And so for me, that's the moment that I went on the brigade, right? I had come out from Chicago, I moved to the Bay Area to go to school, and I connected with the brigade, not knowing really a thing about it. And the brigade, and really then Cuba, just changed my life. You know, because these developments in the left were global, right? Cuba was entering what they called at the time the special period, right? But in a way, we were going through a special period too, right? Right? I mean, materially, I mean, the Helms-Burton bill, the Torricelli, the tightening, the economic war against Cuba, that was what working people and poor people in this country, I mean, I'm not saying it's identical, of course, right? But there was that attack, one-sided class war against poor people, you know? And there was political isolation, too, to be on the left as well, you know? And so entering Cuba and seeing the commitment to the development of socialism, the continued commitment to the development of socialism was just, I mean, I can't emphasize the impact, the personal impact it had on me. Not that there were problems in Cuba. I mean, this is one of the things I really take from it, you know, like, one, yeah, you know what, you can be a socialist, you can be a Marxist and a person of color, right? Like, it wasn't just for, like, 1930s stereotypical white lefties, right? Like, actually, there were thorough Marxists all over the place, right? And yet, it also wasn't romantic, you know, because here was a revolution in crises, but it was a revolution in motion, right? It was a revolution that was seeking to address the contradictions of the moment, special period, right, on the one hand, and also mistakes within the revolution. I'll never forget in the early days of like in the mid-90s, there was lots of discussions around LGBT issues in Cuba and how much of a mistake the early policies towards gays and lesbians in the revolution were. And in the 1990s, I think it was in 95, I mean, there were drag queens who were leading the May Day parade, right? And that, you know, not that, again, that the problems were solved, right? Racism had been solved, but that there was a clear commitment to these transformations in the context of a very different time, place, and condition, right? And yet still be committed to socialism.
Jason, you got 2 minutes.
I got 2 minutes. Okay, well, I'll come back to some of this other stuff, maybe in questions and answers. But I just want to, I'll just end on this. The other thing I got is the honor. Because, you know, you mentioned, Linda, you know, great friends, right? But I think I want to lift that up, right? Like, personally, for me, Eric Quesada became like a brother to me, you know? but so many people, like it's an honor to be involved in the movement. It's an honor to be in company with all of you all, right? To be up here on the panel with these amazing human beings, right? And that there's this larger global community of people who actually believe in a different future, right? They're not perfect human beings, right? But they believe in the necessity of struggle. That what they see out here on 16th, I was walking up here on 16th, right? And you've got this clash of folks in a hunger line looking for food, right? At the same time that you've got these yuppies walking to their upscale sushi joint, right? Right next to each other. I didn't see that in Cuba, right? I didn't see that in Cuba, right? There was struggle in Cuba, but there wasn't that struggle, right? And everybody who's been a part of the brigade has brought that, that sense of outrage and sense of the struggle for dignity home, and try to realize that here. Because ultimately, there's one last thing I want to say, because I don't want this story to escape. Because the most powerful lesson I learned in Cuba was from a 13-year-old. We were at the camp, the Antonio Mea camp, right? The Julio Antonio Mea camp. And one day we went with me, Eric, Khalil Cuno, and a number of other people, Mike Calderon-Zaks, a number of people. And we went and we walked into Caimito, which is the little town outside the camp, right? And it was late in the afternoon, and there was a baseball game that had gotten picked up, right? A pickup game. And so we started playing and everything with the folks there in Caimito. And afterwards, there was a 13-year-old there, and we started talking to him. And remember, it was 1994. And Nelson Mandela, while we were there, had gotten elected, right? And I'll never forget this 13-year-old was like, just talking about Nelson Mandela and how this was such an important struggle, not just for South Africans, but this was a victory for 13-year-old of all oppressed peoples across the world, right? And then he turned to us and he says, but you know something about this, right? Because you had the rebellion in '92 in Los Angeles. And then this 13-year-old said, when will you have your revolution? That question, when we'll have ours, I carry with me every day.